Welcome to Complex Creatures, exploring spirituality and the common good.
Happy Halloween. That's right. Today is Halloween, my friends. 2024. We are on the cusp of an election. And tonight, hopefully, you'll be having some fun with your family and your neighbors and your friends. But right now, my name's Jarrod, and you're with Complex Creatures, our podcast where we like to discuss spirituality as a tool for the public good, the common good, for spaces that we all engage in together, not simply the private world of self-development. I'm with my friend Alan, who's still getting himself ready this morning, but he'll say hi in a moment. Today, I'd like to talk and discuss the concept of the sacred pause. There's this meditation teacher. She's also a clinical psychologist and a Buddhist who I have drawn inspiration from over the years. Her name is Tara Brach. She's got a large presence all over the internet, so you can check meditations of hers out on YouTube. You can read her Wikipedia page. You can follow her in many ways. She's got a book about radical acceptance. But she's the one who mentioned the phrase somewhere in a talk called the sacred pause, and it's been something that's really stuck with me. Have you ever thought about how hurried and harried we live? How frenetic the pace is for daily life? And if you're like me, you start a project or a task, and when you get a few minutes into it, you might even begin thinking about what you have to do next or what you can do to optimize your time. The other day, I was given the task by one of my colleagues at work who's in charge of our digital security. In fact, the entire staff that I serve on at the church is supposed to go and do these, I don't know what they're even called. They're these video trainings. Thank you, Alan. These video trainings, and they're rather cheesy, right? And then you take these little quiz, and we're sitting in staff meeting. And mind you, I have to also tell you, I'm the head of staff in my team. And this person's just sitting there talking to everyone, reminding them that don't forget to do your micro trainings. If we don't, then our security firm that we pay to support us will get mad and blah, 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 blah. And as she's talking, everyone's nodding their heads, and she's slowly turning her head to me because I am the only one who hasn't done these. Now, I've tried. I will tell you that. But here's what happened the last time I tried. I sat to watch these videos, and to me, they're sort of cheesy. I get that they're probably the least dry way to convey the material. So good for them. But I'm still sitting around going, oh, how could I optimize my time? How can I be more efficient? Can I fire off an email? Can I write a thank you card? Can I go search for that quote passively in that tome by St. Thomas Aquinas that I was looking for?
Right.
All along the while, way of doing that. I don't know that I'm listening really well until it's time for me to take the quiz, and I look at it and I go, oh, I'm going to fail this thing. I really just need to give some attention to it. Put it on the back burner, and every time I open my computer, I actually have the email pinned at the top of my email list so that I know I got to do my trainings. But every time I open that inbox is so full, I never get to it. And now I'm embarrassed sitting in a staff meeting being the lone holdout, and I'm supposed to lead by example. Pretty embarrassing. Alan, how are you doing today? Are you hurried and harried on this morning?
I think this might be the first morning we've had one of these where I'm not.
Well, good for you, man.
I had a really good week of getting things done, so I feel like I'm on top of things today, possibly for the first time in months. But I was going to say, in relationship to your story,
yeah,
I have an insane number of these trainings I've got to do around Johnson.
Yeah,
because we have a bunch of sensitive student data, and many organizations like ours have been taken down by cyber criminals, and so there's a whole thing where the IT department here will be personally fined and possibly go to jail if they don't make sure that all the trainings happen the right way.
Oh my gosh.
So they're really, really serious about it. Now, that having been said, I'm going to tell you my secret for getting these things done. Yeah. No, I just fast forward through all the videos and then take the quizzes, and anything on the quiz I don't know, I Google.
I tried that one time, I will tell you, when trying to Google, but it had a very specific lingo that was different.
Oh, I see. From the way that I was there. Didn't work out.
But I might try that. Thank you, Alan. Well, that's just a little narrative, a little anecdote for me about how frenetic my mind can be. And
Sure, sure.
all of
All
us.
of us.
So one thing that Tara Brach says, and she's got a nice talk on it, I believe it's featured on NPR. You can read it in its transcript on her website. She talks about how the entire way that we're sort of structured socially is to think about what we can do and what we can achieve and how we can maximize efficiency for the sake of productivity. There's probably a lot there about what Max Weber, the sociologist, called the Protestant work ethic. It's definitely a hardworking sort of American spirit wrapped up in a lot of it. She waxes, like many have before her, on how we are human beings, not human doings, but do is really the language. I can't believe I just said do, but it is really the language of how we interact. We all know the tropes that people ask you, what do you do when they first meet you? We also have said before that knee-jerk reaction to when someone says, how are you, is to say we're busy. Even if you're not, you feel like you need to be busy. Productivity is really important in our mindset. But there's a quote that she says that I want to set this whole thing off with by Viktor Frankl. And it goes like this. Between the stimulus and the response, there is a space. And in that space is your power and your freedom. Between the stimulus and the response, there is a space. And in that space is your power and your freedom. I will tell you that I think that there is a superhero's amount of power in being able to take a pause, to take a beat, to take a breath, or as Tara Brach calls it, a sacred breath, a sacred pause. Because so much of what we do is reactive by nature. I was once in many times I've been to an academic conference where I'm presenting a paper. One of the strange things to me about the world of academia is that we read papers to each other. Me, the content in any scholastic or scholarly endeavor is probably challenging enough. We should probably find better ways to present and communicate, or clearer ways. But anyway, one of the things that happens at these conferences, you read your paper, and afterwards you take questions. And very seldom have I ever presented where I haven't experienced the all too common reality of people asking you questions that really aren't questions. They're more like comments. And also they're asking or making comments from their particular set of interests or areas of research or specialty. Very seldom do they fully enter into your argument and your world to really try to get to better understanding. They want to sometimes show off, or they sometimes just want to see what it means for them, or maybe a list of any other number of things they want to do. But I've noticed that whenever I was doing those presentations and it was time to answer questions, I remember being very quick to answer questions. I could fire them off the hip really quickly, and I felt like I had to. I felt like that was the requirement. Only to then later, maybe at a coffee or at a lunch or at the hotel bar afterwards in a group of people hanging out, which is really what academic conferences are for. And I think to myself, oh my gosh, I wish I had said this instead of that.
Sure.
And maybe if I had given myself some more time, a pause, a beat, if I even said, let me think about it, and had that moment of perceived awkwardness where I just sit and think, perhaps I would have come up with a better answer than I had on the fly.
Sure.
That is something I deal with a lot, though, because I think people like me are kind of prone to feel a little less comfortable with silence. I'm one of those types that fills silences. And when I don't, it's an act of discipline. But taking a holy pause or a sacred pause for Tara Brach can be freeing in ways that are beyond just answering questions in an academic setting. It can, and I'm going to actually create some categories of things that it can do for us that she doesn't say, but I've gleaned it from her and from my own experience. Sacred pauses can bring clarity, creativity, connection, and calm. Yes, my friends, I endeavored to make them all C words, but let's just go with it for a moment. The sacred pause can bring clarity, creativity, connection, and calm. And what we should probably define what we mean by a sacred pause for a moment, because this is the practice that we're thinking about today. And for Tara Brach, it comes from her teaching as a mindfulness meditation teacher, her psychological work and her work as a Buddhist. And these all kind of come together. And so for her, the sacred pause literally is finding time in your day, in your schedule, and in your daily rhythms to stop and allow yourself a moment of mindfulness, of presence, of awareness, of embodiment, where you stop the frenetic pace of doing and being busy and allowing yourself to be and to receive whatever may come. She talks about it in some cases, even taking place during a speech. She has a story about someone she knows and she admires giving a speech, and they had a complete mental moment where they forgot what they were saying. The person stopped, closed their eyes, took a breath, and even just said to the audience, "This is hard. I'm having a hard time remembering my train of thought." And in that moment, this wasn't a moment where the presentation was all of a sudden derailed, but it was an incredibly life-giving one. Being able to say, "Whoa, hold on, I got ahead of myself." Or I'm having a moment where I can't recall that. Let me take a moment. This can provide a space that things happen in us. I'm going to stop for a moment there for my introduction. And before I get into those C words, Alan, and just throw it to you to see if you have any responses to the way I'm engaging the concepts right now, or just ask you if anything has percolated in your mind as I've been talking.
Well, several things have percolated for me, but I'm actually thinking about the C words in relationship to this. So I'll save some of those thoughts for as we get further into the talk. But I will say this. Pausing to gather my thoughts is something that I'm trying to do more often these days, rather than saying, and that's really difficult for me. From listening to these podcasts that we've been recording, I've realized how bad I am so I'm trying that, number one. The second thing that I'll say is that I'm really looking forward to your thoughts on the sacred pause in relationship to creativity, because I am thoroughly of the opinion that the only way one can generate creativity is both by paying attention to the creativity of others, and then by having enough time to consider what that means for oneself. And I think that a lot of people I know who are struggling because they know that they are creative, but they aren't producing at the level that they wish they were, are having these issues because they aren't taking the time to let the ideas percolate in silence.
Yeah. I too listen to myself on here and realize that I feel a lot of space with the verbal noises. Well, let's go to those C's, like you mentioned, and let's look at the first one. So the sacred pause can bring clarity. And I think in a lot of ways, what we can take from Tara Brach's writings and her teachings is that it allows your mind to catch up with your body. In fact, this has become a practice of mine before I preach, or some of you might be familiar with the language of a sermon or a homily, but this is something I do weekly for several services in our congregation. And I started a practice a while back. In fact, I think I started during COVID, of asking everyone to stop and to ground themselves where they are and to breathe. And I do that because I'm a father of 3 kids, and I guess I'm a reasonably normal person to know that if my life is sort of typical of a lot of people's lives, then getting to church is not always easy. I mean, dealing with all the mess in the morning and a dog and cats. And, in my house, we have 11 chickens in the backyard. You got to take care of the chickens. You got to get the kids fed and dressed. You got to remind them 13 times to brush their teeth. I've got to get myself ready down the road. And, there's 1,000 people I'm going to run into who have a different point of view about the football game the day before or the news, and they're going to share with you. There's just a lot going on. And so by the time we sit down, we act like people are ready to receive something. And I even thought about it from a very selfish perspective. Am I ready to offer anything? So I ask us to breathe and to sit. And then after, I was just doing that, I think, for my own self at first. And I realized that's a good thing for the congregation, because I've been reminded over the years from people that I know and love that we don't really have a lot of space in our world for reflection. It's been removed by distraction and more things to stimulate our brain. So there's no place just for a quiet moment. So I thought, we'll insert it here before the sermon. And then I heard Tara Brach say, taking a sacred pause, letting our mind catch up to our body. or maybe our body's catching up to our mind. Think about it. Maybe our minds are still at home with the coffee maker. Did I turn it off? Did I turn it on? That kind of thing. While our bottoms are sitting in a seat in a building 10 miles from our house. Can we let our mind catch up to our body? It is only when we have that congruity of mind and body, that presence of awareness, that we can really have a clarity. Otherwise, what we hear or what we're engaging in, we'll only have half a mind for at best. Our mind will be somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And I don't know about you. I think everybody can probably relate an experience where you're talking to somebody, they're not fully present, listening, and when you find out what they heard, from what you were trying to say, they only caught part of it. It's a little frustrating. You really can't have the clarity of insight unless we find ourselves in a very present state of being. Alan, there's a tradition. I don't know if tradition is the right word, but there's an observation many people have made about intellectuals and the great thinkers and doers of the ages and walks. Have you ever heard about that?
I have. Yes, multiple times.
Any people come to your mind that took walks?
Yeah, I mean, Sting famously talks about going on walks to write songs.
Okay, Sting. I wasn't thinking of Sting, but cool. Have you seen the show Only Murders in the Building?
Of course.
And season 1, Sting's in it. And Mark goes in the elevator, goes, "Oh, hello, Sting." It just cracks me up when he just addresses him. "Oh, hello, Sting."
Yes, absolutely.
Anyway,
Absolutely.
So Sting took walks to write songs. Cool.
I was going to say Neil Gaiman talks about taking walks to formulate ideas and think through what he's trying to execute. I mean, and if we're talking about actual great thinkers, Einstein.
I love the creative that you write. These are good.
Sure. I would say that I'm still trying to catch up. Not that I'm a great thinker by any stretch of anyone's imagination, but I'm still trying to catch up with a lot of ideas that I formulated when I was in college. I went to college late in life. I went to college when I was 30. I used to live about 100 yards away from the Parthenon in Nashville. So I would walk around the Parthenon every morning for about a mile to a mile and a half. And during that time, I was thinking about all the things that I wanted to accomplish. And I'm still trying to catch up with all those ideas.
Yeah, be careful with that. I'll tell you.
Sure.
Because when I get into those fits, I mean, I have pages and pages. When I was sick and out for a long time on a sick leave.
Sure.
I went on walks to save my life and then my mental health and spirituality. So I would go walk. Mm-hmm. And I came back to work after being out for 6 months, and I had a list of 100 ideas, and I brought it to a meeting, and I overwhelmed them. But
sure.
I was I was hungry, and you had these ideas. But at any rate, you're it's been like that for me too. But and you brought up Einstein and Charles Darwin took walks,
sure.
took walks, Soren Kierkegaard took walks. It's not just that they took walks; it's how important it was to them. And a lot of these people took walks that weren't just around the neighborhood. And they certainly listening to, their music in their ears. They were just out in the world. And some would walk for 30 miles. I mean, so it ranges in practice and habit. And it's certainly, if you're taking a long walk, it's certainly more than just a short pause. But the spirit of it is present in there. It's the idea of taking a beat away from work, away from the workaday, away from tasks, and away from everything at hand. And there's some old adage, right? Or a cliche about if you want your work problems that are so large to get smaller, walk away from them. Taking those pauses often help. There's neurological and psychological reasons why we solve problems away from work. And sometimes we solve them in sleep. There are hacks for writing where people talk about ending your writing unfinished at night, and then when you wake up, then going back to it, because sometimes your mind still works. Now, I'm not going to get into all that because I'm just a novice in those areas. What I do know from my own personal experience is space is important, which is in keeping with the Judeo-Christian tradition of a Sabbath, right? In keeping with the Judeo-Christian tradition of Sabbath, we're allowing a whole space from work. Did they say it was for the purposes of clarity? Not necessarily. But if you look at that Sabbath impulse in that first creation story, what God does is sits back and observes and delights. We've talked about in other episodes on the podcast about leisure and about our own stopping and delighting in the world. That is a sort of clarity that comes when we actually make observations about our relationship to the wider world. That's a certain level of clarity. It's our clarity about where we fit and how we connect and what we rely on for our own life. All too often, the modern mind goes on thinking as though we're autonomous. Autos,
Right.
nomos. Nomos meaning law, autos meaning self. Laws unto ourselves. But we are not autonomous beings by any stretch. We can never be, biologically or socially, or dare I say, theologically and spiritually. So taking a beat can bring that clarity into view. Whereas if we don't take a beat, if we don't take pauses, then we can fool ourselves into thinking that we are enough, and that thinking we're self-reliant, and that thinking that all we have to do is power through. If we just work hard enough and we work enough, we are going to come up with all the answers that we need.
Sure.
But I wonder how confused our brains get. I mean, just from my own kind of experience, I can tell you that when I don't walk away from my work and take a beat, I don't see solutions as well. I just don't. And I sometimes find the solutions in the shower.
Right. When you're forced to be quiet.
Yeah, you're forced to be quiet. Your mind's doing something else. I think in some ways that has to do with allowing ourselves to be at ease instead of a place of tension. And when you're in tension, we're rigid. That's why when we see that we're going to be rear-ended in the rear view mirror, we tense up, and then it actually hurts our bodies more than if we're loose. And this brings to mind the admonition of Bruce Lee, the film star, martial artist, who always would say, be like water. And the whole concept was based on Chinese philosophy and his martial art, but it was being in a state of flow and adaptability.
Yep.
Be more like bamboo, which is strong, but it's very pliable, rather than a rigid wood, which will break. There's something about when we pause that we allow our mind and our consciousness to kind of ease. And sometimes when we're at ease, we find an answer more easily than when we're tense and trying and forcing. At least that works that way in golf, I think. I can tell you.
I think it works that way in nearly everything.
Yeah.
It's certainly true in musicianship. If you tense up, you can't play. It has to be relaxed.
Yeah. Speaking of that, let's move to creativity. And you want to talk about creativity a little. I think the tradition of walks and intellectuals plays in that, because we talked about some of the other creatives. But one reason why I think that a pause, or the sacred pause, I want to keep using her phrase for sacred pause.
I like it.
Because I think that Tara Brach, she was the kind of Buddhist, kind of in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh, not necessarily a theistic Buddhist, but very ethically wanting to apply the Buddhist teachings.
Sure. Secular Buddhism.
Well, what it says on Wikipedia, to be specific for her site, is they call it an engaged Buddhist.
Okay.
She grew up Jewish. I'm not exactly sure what her theistic tendencies are or are not, but I know that it is a non-proselytizing, non-sectarian form of Buddhism. So you don't have full truth for sure. That is something that's just I'm not very strong in my knowledge about. I do know that she uses Buddhism in a lot of ways that I use Stoicism and Buddhism, which is more like a wisdom tradition and a compared Christian wisdom tradition. But one thing that I like the sacred pause, because even if you're non-theist, there's a moment of sacredness here, because there's a great affirmation of self and being within the world, which can flow out of a spiritual tradition of any stripe, but it can also be the ground for a spiritual tradition. So taking the sacred pause can also be effective for creativity. And the first reason that I noted as such is because that it's a mode of being non-reactive. It's a mode of being non-reactive. And if you're like me, creativity doesn't really flow out of being impulsive and reactive per se. Like there may be impulses to creativity. I don't want to go too far down that road. But when I'm talking about reactive, what I have in mind is more of a negative response to negative stimulus that we have. Just something negative in the world, and our reaction is more knee-jerk. We're just reacting rather than responding. And there's a subtle distinction I like to make, where when we react, when I see people react in the world, it's they fire off that email in haste, or they spit out whatever on their mind. And they may say vile or hurtful things. They may say things they regret later. Reactive speech, even if it may be truthful, tends to be non-nuanced and therefore a little more violent. You never do this, you always do that. Language like
Right.
kind of violent because you're kind of dissembling somebody down to some general thing that's sort of hurtful. Responding is to take a beat and to think through an appropriate retort, response, however you want to put it.
Sure.
And that's different. And so I feel as though when we take that sacred pause, we get to sit down and think through or give a space for a more imaginative response to the stimulus of the world. That's the first reason why I think it can aid in creativity. So often, I think that the first answer that we have to a problem may be one that is based in fear rather than in any other emotion. Does that
Sure.
go back to that?
It does.
The first way we react is often based in fear. Somebody says something that we don't like, and our first reaction is to see the thing that's a threat there and go after it. And that's a fear-based thing. And I think that's incredibly limiting. And you take a beat, you have a little more time to think through a different potential, a different pathway. Okay, I'm gonna stop right there because I think it's kind of abstract, Alan. And I want to know if you have any thoughts about that, or you want to tease or push on a question or something.
Let me think about this for just a moment. I think that my world, and by the way, my world is working with students on visual media, visual art, and I also oversee a little bit of music technology kind of stuff here at Johnson. And then I produce a lot of art and music. And I work with a lot of people who are trying to produce a lot of art and music. I think that one of the hardest things for most creatives is exactly what you're talking about, which is reactive, meaning that they see pieces or hear pieces by other creatives, and they think, oh, the thing that I'm doing isn't nearly that good. And so they take that information and they make judgments about themselves that may or may not be true. And I think most of the time they're not true. I think that for a lot of them, what has to happen for them to get to the level that they're trying to get to as a creative is for them to practice, but to your point, have time in between the practice to think about what it is that they have done or not done. There's a thing in creative practice where we say that when you're making the thing, you reserve all judgment. You're not going to judge the thing while you're making it. But then after you've made the thing, you judge the crap out of it, right? Because you want to figure out what there is to learn from what you did, you know? And I think that for a lot of people, they have a difficult time not judging the thing during the act of creation. Because in some ways, I think that the actual physical act of creation, the doing, is in some ways a pause. Because you're trying to turn off the head and do the thing. And I think that that's really, really challenging for people.
Yeah, you're trying to turn off the head in the sense of like the inner critic editor, and you're trying to be present. And ultimately, the heart of the sacred pause is about being present. That is the point. It's about being right to the moment. And so for me, well, I'll give you an anecdote, I think, about taking a beat for creativity's sake, and then I'll talk a little bit about how, in another way, it's helped me be more creative. The other night, I was at a meeting for kind of it was a operational sort of meeting for the church, and we found out that we're going to have some disruption to some construction for a couple different meeting times. And then a group of people who were planning some big festival type of events for an anniversary were upset because that was going to impede their plans and what they've done. And basically we had competing things that ran up against each other on a calendar that couldn't be foreseen because we were responding to the construction needs in real time. So boom, there it is. I have this moment. And I walk away from having this intense and beautiful conversation with someone who's in need. Mm-hmm. And I'm like hearing their brokenness. I'm hearing their hurt and their pain, and it's what I do as a minister. And I prayed with them. I mean, this is where I shine, right? All that administrative stuff is not really where I find a lot of joy, frankly. And I turned the corner, and I'm walking in on the little powwow about what's going on, and it's a little tense. And I had the presence of mind to walk over, thankfully, and instead of react, I heard the data. I was able to take that sacred pause, take a breath, and I go, whew, well, that sounds complicated. Instead of going, okay, what they're saying is sort of threatening to me, because one person's upset about something that's out of my control, but they're still upset, and their upsetness is at least pointed in my direction, which I don't like ever, right? But I can hear some tension between them, and then
Sure.
and then like here's what I think, verbal spewing, right?
Sure.
Able to take that beat and go, that sounds complicated. We don't have to have an answer tonight. In fact, I'll figure it out tomorrow morning. Why don't we just go ahead and, and then I was able to make a joke. Everyone kind of giggled, and I walked out, and I got like a bunch more ideas later on. We're going to solve the problem. No harm, no foul, right?
Right.
More creative solutions came up than finding one and forcing it out of that moment.
Right.
The other reason why I think, or another way I think that this has helped me be more creative, is that it helps me be in touch with myself. So taking that sacred pause before I perform a speech or before I go into a room where I'm going to have to be in some way performative, it allows me to get out of the critical mind and into the greater flow state. It allows me to be more aligned with myself and comfortable with myself. Because otherwise, my mind tells me why I'm not good enough, where I don't measure up, kind of like the creatives you're talking about. You compare yourself to other people. I mean, the one thing you learn about any creative pursuit, whether yours might be music making or drawing, and mine might just be like speaking and preaching, is that you have to find your own voice. You can't just follow the voice of another. You can be inspired and influenced by, but you still have to make something your own for it to really be creative and authentic and meaningful for others.
Sure.
So I have to accept the voice that I have in some way, or the skills and tools I've got. I'm not a 6'10" basketball player. I don't have that skill, right? I've got these skills.
Right.
And this is how it's going to come out. My oddities, my uniquenesses, my like maybe even totally interesting points of view, right? I can take that pause, accept it, accept who I am, lean into the strength. It helps me be more in a flow state rather than a critical, self-criticizing, other criticizing, fear thinking, hedging my bet moment, and I can just be more present. So I think that's very helpful for a creative process. And I found even when I preach, when I take that sacred pause with the whole congregation, sometimes I'm up there in moments where I know people are very upset with me, or they're upset with the world and they're projecting it on it. And I've felt it. And I'm able to take that pause, and that pause go, right? It's got this breath, grounding myself, and realize, you're okay. In fact, you're here for this reason, for an important thing. Go and do. Have fun. Or I can hear my dad say, have fun, big guy. Like when I'm about to do sports. Yeah, have fun. Like, okay, I'm here to play. Let's go.
Yep.
Yeah. Sacred pauses are beautiful things, man. They're beautiful things. Let's move on to the next one, which is connection. Connection. Okay. Right? So the reason why that's so important, and I think it's important for the concept of that we talk about on this podcast about spirituality as a source for the common good. And by the way, folks, if you're listening to this, I was really inspired by Krista Tippett and her book on being wise, when she says, she keeps asking, what kind of century do we want to build together? Like that underlies the question that I'm thinking about when I think about spirituality and the common good. So anyway, what kind of world do we want to live in? Well, I want to live in a better connected world. So I think that taking a sacred pause does lower combative responses. It lowers combative responses. You can already tell where I'm going with this because I've already alluded to it. Instead of reacting, we can make a more faithful or graceful or wise response. I got to tell you, I struggle personally with my natural being of just firing back when someone says something to me. And the closer you are to me, the more easy it is to just fire back without thinking, without pausing, without measuring myself. There's that old adage from construction or from carpentry: measure twice and cut once. And I always think twice and speak once. Otherwise, insert foot in mouth, right? It's a dangerous thing. So being able to take a sacred pause, I think, is an effective tool, even in conflict or in moments where tensions are getting flared and hotter. I went to a hockey game last night and I saw a couple fights, right? They didn't happen because one guy hit another guy and it was a cheap shot, and the guy goes, "That's a cheap shot." And the other guy goes, "You know what? You're right. I'm so sorry. Let me help you up."
Mm-hmm.
It happened because the guy fired off an expletive, another guy fired off an expletive. The next thing you know, we got to throw down. It's usually when we're just reacting and bouncing off each other like pinballs. Boom, 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 boom. So that sacred pause, someone comes at you sideways. They come in at you hot. You find yourself with your tensions rising. Just being able to stop, not talk, just look someone in the eye. Take a breath. Let your mind catch up to the moment. Maybe bring that tension down even a scotch, to say something wiser, to say something more meaningful, to start off with maybe saying, I'm really sorry you feel that way, or to repeat back what you heard. You've heard that. That's a great skill, right? Just to tell people what you've heard.
Absolutely.
Right? But you can't do that in the moment of hotness and heat. So I believe that this is an effective way of connecting. I think beyond conflict, it can be a helpful way of connecting too. When someone is sharing with you something hard that they're dealing with, by not immediately speaking, you prove that you've listened. So it's a weird sort of practical tool. The sacred pause itself gives you a moment to think, process, be present, be real, without firing out something stupid. But it also means that you're not talking. Which is proof that you're listening, or it's at least one proof that you're listening. So it could foster better connection between people. Let's just pause for this moment, everybody, and think about what our political debates would be like if we took sacred pauses. Probably a lot less gaffes, probably a lot less language that's inflammatory. What would it be like at Thanksgiving when you're disagreeing with your loved ones about politics or anything else that's out there in the world? If we took a sacred, you might even have the wherewithal to go, you know what? Sure, I could tell Uncle Bill how wrong he is. I mean, I could show him how smart I am. I could tell him I've done my research, this, that, or whatever. But you might have the presence of thought and mind to say, how's that going to work for me? Is that going to help at all? Or is it better if I just smile and say, well, Bill, can you pass the potatoes? Or, how about those Falcons? I don't know.
Sure.
You begin to make better choices because yeah, sure, you might have the winning argument, but is it going to help the relationship? I think that's a question we don't often ask, right? Someone's wronged you in life, or they bothered you over the years. And we think, well, we got to explain it to them. We got to help them understand. We got to come to some resolution. And maybe in a perfect world, but if you ask yourself the question, how is it going to work out for you really by bringing all this stuff up? Like, maybe sometimes the question you ask yourself is, what's the best way to get through this event right now, given all things? Like, what can I live with? And what would make this the nicest event possible? What do you think about that? I mean, I'm kind of going on.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Actually, I think I have a couple of questions. So you were talking a moment about just replying to people by stating what they said back to them. I think what's helpful for that is that the person you're talking to feels heard.
Yes. Have
you found that sometimes that is enough to find a bridge in connection? Or have you found that, tell me more about that specific thing, because I'm very interested in that idea.
Yeah, so I don't think I'm good at it, but I do think that people want to be understood. I know I do. I probably have a pathology for wanting to be understood. There's this little, acronym, LOVE, LUV, listen, understand, validate. How do you listen? Well, you listen by listening. You don't talk. And also, you're not just thinking of the next thing to say. And when people are doing that, you can see their wheels turning. But when you listen, you make eye contact, you're present, whatever, you're not on your phone, you listen. And then you understand. You understand by repeating back what you heard, which, you probably try to be more creative than just repeating it back verbatim, but you show them, right? You're proving to them. And it's also clarifying for you. You're making sure that you've heard correctly, right? Right. And I think it seems like if you're able to do those two things, let's say someone comes at you sort of hot and angry. By doing those two things, sometimes you get to see the temperature just start going down right then and there. The last step of that little LOVE acronym, listen, understand, validate, is validating their feelings. Mm-hmm. So what I often tell people when I'm counseling with them on this is that if this were the case, if this were something like, as an example, consider this hypothetical between my wife and myself. If my wife came at me pretty upset, declaring that I didn't love her any longer because I've been yelling at her or raising my voice with her or something like that, And, clearly don't love her, because if I loved her, I wouldn't do that. And, I don't love her anymore. And she's giving me her emotional response. The best way to go would be to simply listen and not interrupt, not tell her she's wrong, not to talk over her, and not to be showing her that I'm just thinking of the next retort, but to give her my attention, look at her in the eye, maybe even sit in a non-threatening position with my hands on my lap rather than standing, not be on my phone, listening. And then when she's done, I've given her that space, maybe pause and say, so you feel like I don't love you because I've been raising my voice at you, repeating back what I heard. Oftentimes that brings down the thermometer a little bit, and they usually go, yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. They could go on, or they could be, then you validate. Now, you don't have to validate their claim as a truth or reality claim or the ontological veracity of their claims. You don't have to say, well, you're right, I don't love you anymore, and the yelling is proof. Because that's not true.
Right.
But what is true, what I can validate is their feeling. So how can I do that? I can say, that makes a lot of sense. I guess it makes sense to me that my yelling at you makes you feel like I don't love you. Mm-hmm. So you're validating their feeling. You're validating their sense of processing information. You're validating that they're not crazy. That makes sense to feel the way they feel. The way they feel is maybe normal or human or whatnot. And you haven't ceded any point. You haven't given up ground that they are right in their actual claims, but you've gotten to the heart of the issue with them. It's deeply humanizing. It's deeply dignifying. And by the way, it's incredibly hard to do in the moment. I don't think I'm good at it. I think I'm only good at it when I take these pauses. Like that for me is a real effort of the will, but it's a virtuous one. It's a practice one. When I'm able to do it, I stop. I let myself be present. Letting yourself be present is another way of overcoming the passions.
Sure.
The gut reaction of anger and response and anger and response. So I think that's how I would respond to the reflection that you've made. Yeah.
All right. I've got another question now. Backing way up in the talk.
Yeah.
You were talking about the idea that at the beginning of your sermons, you often ask the congregation to pause and breathe. And by the way, I've been there for that a number of times, and I love it when you do that. Is there some connection between that happening and the connection within the community that's experienced this simultaneously? I don't know. I'm curious if that's a thing.
How do you mean?
Like what I guess I'm asking is this: if you are in a corporate body that is all collectively pausing, is that also fostering a connection? Or is that just for the individuals in the room?
Yeah, I think it totally can. Just like I think a crowd can be worked up into a frenzy of negativity, I think a crowd can be worked up into positivity or hope.
Okay.
I don't want to wade into partisan waters here. We're in the shadow of Donald Trump's rally at Madison Square Garden, and things were said by different speakers that aroused certain responses in the audience, and I think it's just pretty basic psychology of how that works. I think we can work ourselves up into kind of anger easily. I think we can work ourselves up into tribalism easily. I think we can do it with more challenging things. I think Robert Kennedy did it really, really well in 1968 when he was speaking, and I'm drawing a blank on where he was speaking when word came out that Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis. He was speaking to a nearly all Black audience. And he walked out and had to tell this audience that Dr. King was just assassinated. He handled it with reverence and grace and a level of sophistication about race relations, I think, that was beyond many in that time. And it was able to be a moment, a shining moment in his candidacy and in his person, in his human history. He didn't bring comfort per se, like you don't comfort that, but he brought a comforting or he brought a gravitas to the morning, and he asked them not to react, and he entered into grief with them, and I believe he was. But I don't want to be partisan. I think there's glowing times when President Bush did this, and Reagan, and all sorts of different leaders, different parties. I think it's harder. But I think that it can be. So let me give you a delightful example of where I think. Please. This, and in this podcast, And in my life, you'll hear me reference Fred Rogers and Mr. Rogers a lot because I find him to be such a compelling figure. He had a habit of doing this 1-minute meditation. They call it sort of a party trick, but when he did his commencement speech at Dartmouth and other places, he did this where he says, and I think when he won an Emmy, he did it for 15 seconds because, they give you a timer on your acceptance speech. And he gave them the gift of time, and he invited them to spend a minute thinking about everyone who loved you into existence, who let you be who you are right now, right? And people express how those moments, him doing that with them you could see them practicing it in the documentary they made about him, and they are tearing up. One thing I found very compelling about the film about Mr. Rogers with Tom Hanks is playing him talking to the character that's supposed to portray Tom Junot, who is a real life journalist, and they're in a cafe, and he asks him to do that exercise in the cafe, and the camera pans to the left, I believe, of the two. It widens up to show the whole cafe, and when you look, if you know the characters, you know the people, you will realize that the people in the cafe are Mr. Rogers' real life wife, his real life adult children who worked on his show, actors who were on the screen in his show, people behind the screen on his show. They were Mr. Rogers' neighborhood community there, and they were the extras. And they all do the meditation right there. It's like a weird breaking of the fourth wall. Maybe you don't even know what's happening because you're not really that tuned into the movie. And I think it's an incredibly effective moment in that filmmaking process. And you have this moment where people sincerely sit together and they think with gratitude about people who gave them life and meaning and gave them a leg up. Whew, yes. It's as good for individuals as it is for a community and vice versa, for sure.
Interesting.
That's why I think speaking in front of people is such a powerfully dangerous thing. You have to be careful.
It is.
Well, the last one I want to bring up is that it can bring calm. The sacred pause can bring calm. It is actually a work against the frenetic energies. And let's go back to that quote from Viktor Frankl that Tara Brach actually uses herself. Between the stimulus and the response, there is a space. And in that space is your power and your freedom. That has been present through each of these steps, that freedom to do something unique, that freedom to do something creative, that freedom to do something that is not typical to your normal reaction. All of this does remind me of Jesus himself, Mark 1:35, very early in the morning. Now, this is after he's been with the crowds. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. You can find elsewhere in the Gospels, before he dies, before he's murdered and betrayed, he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. He takes these pauses of calm. They seem to be calm amidst the storm of life. You could argue and psychoanalyze and make suggestions about what Jesus is doing. I think this is his prayer life, but it's a readiness position. It's a beat, an empty space in all the frenetic panic of the world that gives something life-giving. It's like in poetry, there's this caesarea, I think is how you pronounce the word. You ever read a poem and you see there's spaces, you're supposed to pause. Those absent spaces are pauses, and they're meant to be filled with something other than the word itself. Some people suggest in the Psalms, when you read that word Selah, that it might have been a musical annotation of pause. But you know, as a musician, Alan, that there is as much in a pause as there is in a sound.
Absolutely.
Sometimes to make the melody or the percussive beat meaningful, the pause is just as, it's just one side of it, right? So these absent spaces, and physical art too, like visual art, right? The way you conceive of space, and I don't know how to even say it because I'm not an aesthete like you, but that's one thing I find meaningful about Japanese art is the way they imagine space. It can take an empty space and it still be empty, but somehow it's adorned with beauty that is beyond just an empty canvas, right? Like
Absolutely,
it does something. I can't even describe it. I wish that I knew a word for it. Space isn't bad. It brings the calm amidst all the frenetic hurry. And for me, what is life for? That's a question I often ask. I know I ended the sentence with a preposition, but what is life for? Is it for just another task to be done? Or is there something about life that's meant to be lived? It sounds silly to say life is meant to be lived, but really it is. And how can you live outside of the present? I mean, if you're never present, then you're missing everything, right? I mean, pretty simple thing to say, incredibly, incredibly challenging to do, which is why we don't take sacred pauses. It's why we don't take beats. It's why we don't take Sabbaths. There's always more to do. There's always more to do. You can make more money. Keep going, right?
No.
What do you think?
I've been reading the transcription of the sacred pause sort of out of the corner of my eye as you've been talking, just scanning it to see if there was anything that was sort of in addition. And there's a quote down here at the bottom that I'm going to read that I think is a response to what you just said. And it says, just stop, really stop, home into this being. And I think that idea of coming home into the pause is, I think, a big part of what you're discussing right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Some people who might hear this today, Alan, might think of this as just a strategic psychological thing for life.
Sure.
You know me, I don't think spirituality is devoid of psychology or biology or anything else. I think it's all a thing. And so it makes sense to me that this is healthy for our minds and our bodies. I happen to think, though, it's a deeply spiritual impulse, at least because it's about how we connect. But I think it's about how we connect to the wider world, to ourselves, to our understanding of God, to one another. And I think if we took more of these sacred pauses, I think we would at least be a better social self than we are. I've been learning more about listening rather than speaking. And when I say learning, I don't mean I've been learning new ideas or new content. I've just been learning better how to be more silent and listen more. Fred Rogers did a show called Old Friends, New Friends. It interrupted Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood for a few seasons, and it didn't make it, but he wanted to do a show for adults. It was an interview show, and people might have watched it and said he was a terrible interviewer. The reality is he was a fantastic interviewer, but his own mode of being was too slow for television, and it was too quiet. So he, on that show, would interview folks like Yo-Yo Ma, and he would talk, and he would ask questions, and then he would stop, and he would sit in the pause so long that it would make the person keep talking, which is what you do in a good interview. Sometimes you just, and then he would lean in closer. And it just wasn't fast-paced enough for television. That was one of the things he had as a critique about TV. He went into TV because he thought it was a powerful medium, but he didn't like it. He didn't watch TV. He thought it was a silly, silly, silly thing for crazy, frenetic salesmanship, pies in the face and all that. He was critical of Sesame Street because it was about education through rote memorization, and it was a lot of like distract and keep your attention. He would often tell his friends that my gift is one of silence. Like that was his gift to people. So as I've mentioned before, he asked the audience of children, how long does a minute feel? And he put an egg timer and he did a minute of silence on TV. This is not good TV, right? Yeah, it was compelling because of the demographic he was going for and who he was. The blinking yellow light at the beginning of his show is an indication. I've mentioned that on this episode, on this show before. That kind of way of being, I think today yearn for it. We may not watch it, but we yearn for it. There's still something compelling about Fred Rogers. He keeps coming up. I think it's because his messaging and his style is needed. But his style was born of sacred pauses, being present, catching up, being there and entering into. How else might you see? I'm going to let you have some final words here. How is there any way besides what I've suggested that you might see that sacred pausing could be helpful for us in a public sort of way or in a communal sort of way?
Well, I'll be honest with you and tell you that when you sent me the text that we were going to be working on this, I had like a moment of fear because I actually just edited the episode we did that people will hear before this one on the subject of festival and taking breaks as a spiritual tool. And my write-up description of it, I went for the podcast. I sent it off to my wife after I wrote it because I thought that she would think it was hilarious. But what I wrote was, in this episode, Jarrod discusses festival and celebration as a spiritual tool. Alan sits there baffled the entire time.
Okay.
And the reason that I say this is because taking time off is not easy for me. And pausing is a version of that. It's a smaller version of that, but it's still a version of that. Where I feel like I do well with pausing is this whole being in the moment or the things that I have to do kind of a thing. And at one point in time, I think I was very good at taking walks, like you described at the beginning of this talk. But I don't think I'm very good at any of it right now in terms of taking walks or being silent or whatever. My life at this particular moment is filled up with a lot of go, 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 go.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's good, and sometimes that's not good. And I think that I have hit a saturation point where it's not good. But I appreciate the encouragement in this episode for me rethinking about how I can pause and be present at all times, or not at all times, but at least sometimes. I have two really great jobs, both at Johnson University and there at Peachtree Christian. And I feel like I have a lot of support from the people around me. And I feel like it enables me to do a better job than I would otherwise. But I have a situation at Johnson right now with one of the classes where I don't think I handled some things well at the beginning of the semester as a result of not pausing and thinking through all of what we have discussed today. I have some ideas about how I might be able to do some corrective work in that class.
Wow. Well, I will certainly encourage you on in that. I will tell you that, and this is a bit confessional too, and this will be my concluding thought on it. You know, for those of you who know me or listened to this enough, heard enough of these stories to know that I went through the sickness of liver disease and a liver transplant, and there was just a lot of time in the sickness when I was very short-tempered with my loved ones. Mm-hmm. When you're that near to death and that pain and stuff, you're not your best and probably an overly temperamental person anyway. But I found myself speaking to my wife and my kids in ways that I'm not proud of, or being ungrateful, or, barking at my mom and dad, whatnot. It's just being pretty pitiful and miserable. And growing through a lot of it, I started this little practice of a holy pause, a sacred pause when I get home, whether it's from the office in the middle of the day. I do go home and like middle afternoon to go do like deeper work there, or at night, like after a meeting, I come home and I know I'm going to walk in, the kids are going to be running around, the kitchen's going to be a mess. No one's going to be ready for like bed yet. Right. Mm-hmm. And that can frustrate me, walking from one kind of chaotic thing to another chaotic thing. When all I want my home to be is a sanctuary, I can naturally be frustrated. But what I've been doing is I'll sit in the driveway and I'll just turn off my car and I'll take a breath. And I'll say, just be present. Just leave that in the past, your meeting or whatever, and go be present. Mm-hmm. Be excited to see your family. Welcome. They're going to be excited to see you. Daddy, daddy, daddy. So match their excitement, because you really do have excitement to see them, and just be present. And the days I do that, I'm better. I'm more present to my family. I'm more present to my kids. I treat them better. And if there's a way I can be better for the wider world, it's to be better for my family, for sure. And that will translate. So anyway, friends, take a sacred pause. Look at Tara Brach's work. I think any religious or spiritual tradition you have, you could probably use some of her insights on mindfulness or meditation. I think that she's got great ideas, at least fodder for your thinking. And if you don't want to go down that road, well, just take my word for it. Take a sacred pause, take many, take a breath, take a walk. Connect, slow the mechanism down, be present. God bless you, everyone.